So we knew that mosquitoes use different sensory modalities to find us. They use olfaction, their sense of smell, and smell CO2 or body odors. But they also use vision, and they are capable of perceiving our body temperature. But as you know, how these different sensory information are processed and integrated in the brain was not known. And so what we did here is that we combined different techniques from quantitative analysis of behavior, mathematical modeling, but also molecular biology to investigate how the brain was processing this information. And so what we found is that when mosquitoes smell CO2, the brain area that processes olfactory information sends some signal to the brain regions that process visual information. And this modulation of the activity of these neurons in this region will lead to better accuracy for the mosquitoes when they are tracking odors, basically, and visual objects. Mosquitoes, we've shown previously that they are capable of learning and remembering information about us, and in particular to remember who is easy to bite, who is more defensive and should be avoided. And here we're showing that basically as they navigate towards us, they're also capable of extracting information from multiple sensory modalities, using this integration to refine their host-seeking behavior and become more efficient at tracking visual objects. For the flight simulator, it's basically a virtual reality environment for mosquitoes. And mosquitoes are attached in the middle of this cylinder made of LEDs. And what happens is that you can display whatever you need on this screen. And that could be star fields, looming objects, fading objects, or rotating objects like squares and bars. And so we use that to test whether the responses of mosquitoes to these different visual stimuli would differ in the presence or in the absence of CO2. And we found that if they smell CO2, mosquitoes respond with a greater accuracy in their tracking to smaller discrete objects such as squares and bars. And so our next step was to use a genetically engineered line of mosquitoes that express this the fluorescent calcium indicator in the brain, and test how the brain was actually being modulated by the stimulation with CO2. The results are telling us that mosquitoes should be looked at as a whole, and including all the sensory information they can perceive when they're tracking us, and that could potentially inform the design of new baits or traps that will be more efficient at catching mosquitoes using vision and olfaction, but also maybe potentially help us develop some clothes or fabric that would disrupt the ability of mosquitoes to track us down. We have to keep in mind that anytime a mosquito is flying around and looking for us, they are taking a risk, because for the females, they absolutely need the nutrients and proteins from our blood to produce their eggs, so we are some of their food, but at the same time we are a threat, and we can kill them in the attempt. And so mosquitoes have optimized and maximized their chances of obtaining the blood by outsmarting our defense behavior and our different ways of looking for them and preventing them from biting. And so in my lab, what we're doing is we're looking at the processes that allow mosquito to be that good and that efficient at what they're doing. And so among other things, we're looking at how time of day will impact their responses to different host signals and see how these changes through time. We have evidence from recent observation that mosquitoes are not only developing some resistance to insecticides, but they are also developing some behavioral resistance to some of our control strategies. An example that's all over the news recently is mosquitoes in Africa that are changing their activity time and biting time to avoid being confronted to people being hidden behind bed nets. And so now they start being active later in the early morning, basically. And so I would argue that it's only by better understanding how mosquito manage to do what they are doing that we can invent new control strategies to prevent them from outsmarting our current tools.